Trucks are built to dominate the roads, powerful machines designed to haul massive loads across highways and cities. But when something goes wrong, that same power turns deadly. These aren't just routine accidents. They're full-scale disasters that happen in a flash, leaving chaos, fire, and devastation behind. From fiery explosions to unimaginable pileups, the aftermaths are as haunting as they are heartbreaking. In this video, we'll uncover 5 of the most disturbing truck crash deaths ever recorded. It was the early morning of December 29, 2024, in Ethiopia's Sidama region, a quiet day that would soon turn into one of the country's darkest. On the narrow Jalana Bridge, a truck overloaded with passengers crept forward, its metal frame groaning under the weight. Inside and atop the vehicle, people clung tightly to some weary laborers returning from long days at a coffee plantation, their clothes still dusted with harvest soil. Others dressed in bright colors, fresh from a nearby wedding that had filled the night with laughter and music. For most, it was meant to be nothing more than a simple ride home. Instead, it became a journey into tragedy. As the truck neared the midpoint of the bridge, its tires hugged the crumbling edge of a road notorious for sharp bends and sudden drops. Then, without warning, the driver lost control. The truck swerved violently, skidded, and in an instant of horror, it broke through the side barrier, plunging straight into the Ganale Doria River below. The sound was deafening, metal twisting, glass shattering, and then silence as the vehicle vanished beneath the rushing water, taking dozens of passengers with it. What followed was chaos. Villagers sprinted to the scene, diving into the muddy current, shouting names into the air thick with panic. They clawed through the wreckage, searching for anyone still breathing. Slowly, the river began to release its victims' bodies, surfacing one by one, pulled onto the banks where blue tarps were laid out in grim rows. 68 men and 3 women were gone in seconds, families shattered, entire communities paralyzed by grief. Some parents found their children lifeless. Others realized they had no one left to search for. A handful of survivors were rescued. 4 in total pulled from the water, battered, unconscious, barely clinging to life. They were rushed to Bona General Hospital, one in such critical condition he had to be transferred to a larger facility miles away. Their testimonies were faint and broken, but the horror in their eyes said everything. The screech of the tires, the desperate screams as water filled the truck, the crushing silence afterward. Officials later confirmed what locals had long feared: the truck had been severely overloaded, far beyond capacity. Passengers were squeezed inside shoulder to shoulder, with others perched on top of the cabin, holding on as the vehicle swayed dangerously. Witnesses said the truck missed the bridge entirely at the curve, plunging headfirst into the river like a falling stone. It was the kind of tragedy many in Ethiopia knew too well: preventable, predictable, and devastating. By nightfall, the Galana riverbank had transformed into a scene of mourning. Families wept over rows of covered bodies, their cries echoing across the valley as the sun disappeared behind the hills. Rescuers stood in silence, drained and mud-soaked, staring at the wreckage that had claimed 71 lives. For Ethiopia, it was another entry in a long, heartbreaking pattern. The nation has one of Africa's highest rates of road fatalities, where overloaded trucks, poor road conditions, and weak enforcement turn everyday journeys into deadly gambles. But for Sidama's people, this wasn't just another statistic. It was the loss of brothers, sisters, parents, and friends whose lives extinguished in a single plunge off the Jalana Bridge, leaving an entire community drowning in grief. It was the dark, misty morning of January 27, 2021, in the west region of Cameroon. The air was thick with fog along the winding roads near the cliff of Jang, a stretch of highway notorious for sharp turns and steep descents. It was around 3:30 a.m., and a 70-seat passenger bus made its way uphill, carrying families, workers, and travelers returning from the bustling coastal city of Douala to Bafoussam. Some passengers were dozing, others chatting quietly, unaware that within moments their journey would end in unimaginable horror. Out of the darkness came a blinding light from a fuel truck, speeding downhill, its brakes already failing. Witnesses later said it was moving too fast, perhaps over 120 kilometers per hour. the driver fighting to control it on the slick, fog-drenched slope. But there was no time to react. In an instant, the truck slammed head-on into the bus. The explosion that followed was so violent it could be heard miles away. Within seconds, the two vehicles were engulfed in flames, a roaring inferno of twisted metal and burning fuel. Inside the bus, dozens were trapped, unable to break the windows or reach the doors as the fire spread. The smell of fuel filled the air. People screamed, clawed at the seats, trying desperately to escape, but the heat was unbearable. Flames swallowed everything. By the time rescuers arrived, the night sky glowed orange over the cliffside, and the bus was a shell of blackened steel. 53 people were dead, many burned beyond recognition. 29 others, their bodies seared and blistered, were pulled out alive and rushed to hospitals in Chiang and Bafoussam. For some, survival would come with scars that would last forever. Governor Awa Fonka Augustine stood at the scene later that morning, staring at what was left. He confirmed what many feared: the truck had been illegally carrying fuel and had suffered brake failure. The dense fog had made visibility nearly impossible. A speeding truck illegally transporting fuel ran into a 70-seat bus, he said solemnly, his words echoing over the smoldering wreck. A collision between the truck and the bus sparked uncontrollable fire, which ravaged the vehicles and their occupants. The devastation was so complete that 22 of the bodies could not even be identified. Blue sheets covered the remains as families gathered in disbelief, hoping to find loved ones among the survivors. For many, there was nothing left to recognize, only ashes and twisted wreckage. Police and emergency teams worked through the night, pulling remains from the charred metal and searching for clues. 3 men, occupants of the truck, had survived and fled the scene immediately after the crash, but authorities would later order their arrest. The tragedy sparked national outrage. Road safety advocate Manfred Missimikan called it a succession of negligence, pointing out that the fuel truck had no legal right to transport such a load, and that Cameroon's winding mountain roads were too dangerous for night travel. For locals, though, this wasn't just another headline, it was a nightmare that felt too familiar. Cameroon's roads are narrow and treacherous, carved into steep hills and often cloaked in fog. Vehicles are overloaded, drivers overworked, and safety rules rarely enforced. People begged the government to ban night journeys or to repair the mountain routes that had claimed so many lives. It was the afternoon of September 17, 1963, in the quiet farmlands outside Chwaler, California. A flatbed truck, crudely converted into a bus, rumbled down a dusty private road, carrying 58 migrant farm workers. They were exhausted after a long, back-breaking day harvesting celery, packed shoulder to shoulder on wooden benches beneath a flimsy canopy. For most, this was just another ride back to camp. For 32 of them, it would be their last. The driver, Francisco Pancho Espinosa, was a foreman trusted to transport his crew. The men behind him, many part of the Bracero program, Mexican laborers brought to California to fill agricultural jobs, couldn't see the road ahead or speak to him over the roar of the engine. The truck rattled east along Thomas Ranch Road, a narrow lane that cut across a lonely railroad track. There were no warning lights, no crossing gates, not even a sign. Just 2 lines of steel running through the dirt, glinting faintly in the afternoon light. From the south, a Southern Pacific freight train thundered toward them, 4 diesel locomotives pulling 71 loaded cars at nearly 65 miles per hour. The engineer saw the truck too late. He yanked the emergency brake. Sparks screamed from the wheels, but the train was too heavy, too fast. Espinosa crept forward, unaware of the danger, and in one horrifying instant, metal met metal. The impact was cataclysmic. The train tore through the truck bus like paper, splintering wood and steel, hurling bodies into the air. The wreckage was dragged for nearly half a mile down the track, scattering twisted debris and lifeless forms along the rails. Those who survived the first impact were flung onto the gravel, battered, broken, and bleeding. Some were cut by their own harvest knives, others impaled by splintered boards. One man was severed in half beneath the wheels. Witnesses said the aftermath was indescribable. 23 died instantly, and 9 more succumbed to their injuries soon after. 15 ambulances rushed to the scene, but the horror was overwhelming, the tracks slick with blood, the air thick with smoke and cries of pain. One rescuer would later recall that blood poured out of an ambulance, like water. The victims ranged from 19 to 59 years old, fathers, brothers, and sons who had left behind dozens of children in Mexico, depending on them for survival. When the chaos subsided, only Espinosa, the driver, was found unhurt. Every passenger had been crushed, burned, or thrown from the vehicle. For days, authorities struggled to identify the dead. Most of the workers were known only by numbers, not names, a dehumanizing hallmark of the Bracero system. The FBI had to be called in to help with identification, while families in Mexico waited in agony for word that never came. The funeral arrangements became a public scandal. Officials in Salinas and the Mexican consulate argued bitterly over who would claim the bodies. Newspapers described a macabre funeral hassle, a final indignity for men who had died serving the very system that erased their identities. When the dispute finally ended, a mass funeral was held at Palma High School, where over 9,000 mourners filled the stands. Coffins, draped in flowers, stood side by side, each representing a life lost to indifference and exploitation. In the weeks that followed, investigators searched for answers. The Interstate Commerce Commission concluded that Espinosa had an unobstructed view of the tracks and blamed him for failing to stop. He insisted he never saw or heard the train through the dust and noise, and some believed his diabetes impaired his vision. Espinosa was charged with 32 counts of manslaughter, but a jury later acquitted him after only 4 days of testimony. Soon after, he fled California, haunted and in fear for his life. Rumors spread that he'd been killed in Mexico by the victims' relatives, though that was never confirmed. Years later, families received modest compensation, a $1.5 million settlement divided among the survivors and heirs, a small price for so much loss. Labor activist Ernesto Galarza investigated the disaster and uncovered the painful truth. These men had been failed by every layer of the system, by employers who cut corners, by officials who ignored safety, and by a government that saw them as numbers instead of names. His report, Tragedy at Schwaller, exposed the exploitation behind the harvest fields that fed the nation. Today, the site of the crash near the intersection of Poleta Road and Broome Road looks ordinary. The tracks are still there, silent and rusted. But for those who remember, the silence is deafening. It was there that 32 men who came to America chasing dignity and work were crushed beneath the weight of a system that saw them as invisible. It was a humid morning on September 21, 1989, in Alton, Texas, a quiet town in the Rio Grande Valley where life usually moved slow. Children filled the yellow school bus with laughter and chatter, unaware that within minutes, their morning ride would become one of the deadliest school tragedies in Texas history. The bus, carrying over 80 students aged 12 to 19, rolled down Farm to Market Road 676. It had just picked up its last passenger when a Dr. Pepper delivery truck, operated by Valley Coca-Cola Bottling Company, sped through a stop sign. In an instant, impact. Witnesses said the sound was deafening. Metal folding into metal, glass exploding, screams tearing through the air. The force sent the bus careening off the road into a massive caliche pit, a water-filled crater left from mining. There was no guardrail, no barrier, just open space. The bus plunged straight into 10 feet of muddy water. Inside, chaos. Students clawed for windows, gasping as icy water surged in. Within a minute, the bus disappeared beneath the surface. The windows were too small, the exits too few, and the dark water made escape nearly impossible. Survivors said it felt like the world had gone black all at once. Rescuers arrived quickly. Border Patrol agents, police, volunteers, but visibility was zero. They dove blind, breaking glass, pulling out whoever they could. Parents stood at the edge, screaming names, praying for movement. Bodies were brought up one by one until the pit grew silent. 21 students were gone, 19 that morning, 2 more days later. None had suffered visible injuries. They had simply drowned, trapped inside the bus that once carried them safely to school. In Alton, grief was unbearable. The next day's football game turned into a memorial. hundreds gathering under the Texas sun to mourn. But as time passed, sorrow gave way to blame. Truck driver Ruben Perez was charged with 21 counts of negligent homicide but later acquitted. He lived with torment, saying, "Even though now I'm free, I still feel so much for the kids. I don't know if I'll ever get better." Lawsuits followed. The bottling company and the bus manufacturer paid over $150 million in settlements, but the money only deepened wounds. Some called it blood money. Neighbors grew distant, friendships ended, and a once-united community splintered under grief and resentment. The tragedy did lead to change, and guardrails were finally installed along FM 676 and other pits nearby. A junior high school and park were later named in memory of the 21 victims, marked with white crosses and a statue of Christ. Every September, parents still gather there, placing flowers beneath their children's names. It was May 14, 1988 in Carroll County, Kentucky. A church youth group from Radcliffe's Assembly of God had spent the day at Kings Island Amusement Park. Their bus filled with teenagers still buzzing from roller coasters, junk food, and inside jokes. As they headed home, tired but happy, the hum of the road felt safe. It was supposed to be just another long ride back to Radcliffe, but at 10:55 p.m., their world turned into fire. Coming from the opposite direction, a black Toyota pickup tore through the night traveling the wrong way down the highway. Behind the wheel was 34-year-old Larry Mahoney, a factory worker so drunk he didn't realize he was speeding directly into oncoming traffic. Seconds later, headlights met headlights, and there was no time to react. The truck slammed head-on into the bus with devastating force. The collision shattered metal, crumpled the front end, and ruptured the bus's unprotected fuel tank. At first, it seemed like a survivable crash. Almost no one had been fatally injured on impact, but then came the fire. The leaking gasoline ignited instantly, flames racing up the aisle. Panic erupted. Inside, 67 people, most of them children, scrambled to escape. The front door was jammed shut from the impact. Thick black smoke poured through the narrow aisle as the heat became unbearable. Screams filled the air, desperate cries for help, for mothers, for anyone. Survivors said the fire spread in seconds. Within 20 seconds you could feel the heat, one said. You heard kids crying, pushing, trying to get to the back. We were all jammed together. The only exit was a small rear emergency door. Everyone fought to reach it. Dozens pressed into the 12-inch wide aisle, bodies crushing together in the dark. A cooler that had been placed in the aisle only made things worse, trapping people halfway down the bus. Some tried to break the windows, but they wouldn't budge. One small woman managed to squeeze through a side window. When she looked back, the opening was filled with flames. Outside, passing drivers pulled over and tried to help. They smashed windows and dragged out as many as they could before the inferno became too fierce to approach. Within minutes, the bus was completely engulfed, a roaring fireball on the side of the highway. The children, still trapped inside, never had a chance. When firefighters finally extinguished the flames, the damage was almost too horrific to comprehend. 27 people were dead, 24 children, 2 adults, and the bus driver. 34 more were injured, many with severe burns. The youngest victims were just 10 years old. Their bodies were later found piled toward the back of the bus, all facing the same direction, all toward the only escape they could not reach. For investigators, it was one of the most disturbing scenes they'd ever encountered. No one on the bus had died from the collision itself. Every life lost that night had been claimed by smoke and fire. The 11-year-old bus, once a school vehicle, had a design flaw that turned it into a trap. The gas tank was exposed. The seat covers were made of flammable vinyl, and the exits were too few. Larry Mahoney survived the crash. His blood alcohol level was 3 times the legal limit. He later said he remembered nothing. Not the bar, not the highway, not the crash. In the hospital, he had to be told what he'd done. He was charged with 27 counts of murder and sentenced to 16 years in prison for manslaughter and assault. He served 9.5. In the years that followed, Kentucky changed forever. The Carrollton crash became a turning point in American road safety and in the fight against drunk driving. Some of the victims' families became leaders and mothers against drunk driving, MAD, including Carolyn Nunnally, who later became the organization's national president. laws toughened. Buses were redesigned with stronger fuel tanks, fireproof seats, and multiple emergency exits. Today, Kentucky's school buses have 9 exits, more than any state in the country. But for those who were there, no law or reform could erase that night. Survivors spoke of nightmares, of guilt, of the smell of burning vinyl that would haunt them for decades. Parents described the unbearable silence that filled their homes afterward, bedrooms left untouched, laughter that never returned.